So I've been claiming that if you go through this 52 weeks of Python, that at the end of the day, you will be able to build stuff that looks like this. This is the architecture of the whole thing. This is a simple terminal-based output. This is a user interface. This is some graphs behind the scenes. There's a web service with RESTful APIs. There's a database. There's monitors and discoverers and scanners, and there's port scan and capture, and there's messaging, all this stuff. I've been claiming that at the end of the day, you will be able to do this if you go through the class. And you may be asking the question, how am I going to learn all of that? Well, that's what I'm going to explain to you right now. So the first thing we're going to do, or we're doing in this class, is teach you the basics. So you'll learn about lists and dictionaries. You'll learn about functions. You'll learn about strings and how to print stuff, how to do if statements, how to nest your data, and things of this nature. So we're going to learn about that. Then we'll move on to some intermediate topics, things that may be useful to you in a more intermediate or advanced level, like list comprehensions and tuples and sets and regular expressions, things of that nature. So we're at the end of those two modules, we will have a pretty good grasp of Python. Then we're going to move on to what I call files here. Really, it's how things are stored or conveyed from one entity to another. So we'll learn about JSON and we'll learn about YAML. I'll also throw in XML and CSV in there so you have an understanding of those because they're used as well. Then the next thing we're going to look at is networking. Now there's a ton of files in here, but there's a few things that are going to be important that we're going to learn about. We're going to learn about Napalm. We'll learn a little bit about netconf. That's not that important, neither is netmiko, but one that is important is Nmap. We'll be learning about that. PyShark is good for scanning data and capturing packets. And Scapy is very important. We'll be learning about those networking things. And so that's what we'll be doing next. Once we've got that stuff under our belt, then we can begin to move into the real fun stuff. So things like web applications, and in our example, we'll be using Flask. This is where these type of pictures come in, the first thing that we'll be building, and you can see the relationship over here on the left with what I have in this picture over here on the right. We'll have host discovery and host monitoring. That's in this box that you see there. We'll have display. Hey, guess what? That's basically this thing that you're looking at right there. And we will be using a Flask application server that has a RESTful API. So all of that is coming in this module 5. And so you can see this is the basics of Flask. I'm going to be adding port scan to that. I think I have a picture. Here's the picture that shows not only port scan functionality that's in the host monitoring, but also service and device display. And as you can see over here in this module, module 5D, we have all of not only host, but also devices and services running, basically providing this functionality that you see. So not only will you have a host display, but a service display and a device display, as well as creating device monitoring and service monitoring functionality. So here you've got this really cool application now. It's a web application with a RESTful API from which you can generate displays and which you feed using these monitoring processes, applications that we will be building. Once we've learned about Flask, we're going to spend some time learning about object-oriented programming. That would be classes and functionality related to classes such as inheritance, and we'll actually be using that in some of our monitoring as we go forward. The next one, module 7, we learn about databases. So if I was to go to my next picture here, we can see that the data that used to be just regular data inside the application is now getting stored in a database of some type. And we'll look at two databases, SQL database, as well as a NoSQL database, which is going to be Mongo. So we will be learning databases next. Once we've learned about Flask and then databases, we're going to learn about a more advanced topic, which is concurrency. So we're going to do threads, thread pools, async I/O, things of that nature, and learn how that works. And we will make our monitoring functionality work so much better because we make use of threading and concurrency. Then we're going to say, hey, what if we get tired of this terminal-based output and want to put it in an actual user interface and do things in kind of a big kid kind of way. And that's what we will be learning about next. It's a big step. It's kind of a quantum leap to do JavaScript in the way that we end up doing this user interface stuff. You can ignore it if you want. You can just use these other displays. That's perfectly fine. But the user interface does add some interesting functionality. So we will be learning next about user interfaces. Once we've done user interfaces, we're pretty close to having everything implemented. So the next thing we're going to talk about is messaging. Messaging is basically the ability to send messages to external applications, so communication between applications that's not REST-based, but it's sending a message that's going to go into a message queue, and we have workers that do port scans and packet capture and traceroute, and so we will be implementing that functionality as well as using messaging in order to do it. And that will basically round out what our quokka-prime product is like. At that point in time, we have implemented everything that you see on this screen plus a little bit more. So as you can see, this is what we're building towards. There's a bunch more stuff that we talked about. Swagger will have stuff on recursion, unit testing, a little bit of ethical hacking type stuff for cracking passwords and denial of service. A little bit about, hey, you want to learn Java, you want to learn Go. We'll be going into that as well. But basically, the idea is I wanted you to see that we will be implementing fundamentally everything that you see here, and it will provide you all of this stuff. And we'll be doing it just by going through this 52 weeks of Python. Everything that we implement is relatively small and concise, and in my mind, relatively easy to understand. So yeah, that's where we're going with this. Hopefully you'll stick with us and you'll learn all this stuff. If you do, you will definitely be able to call yourself a software developer. You're not a script writer. You're not to cast aspersions on just DevOps, but you've moved beyond that into having true software development skills. And of course, you'll only realize that if you write the software as we go, write and test often, and you'll learn this stuff. Hopefully, you'll be able to stick with it and join the ranks of software developers. So hopefully this little walkthrough of what we're doing has whet your appetite to be excited about learning all this stuff. We'll go from the basics and learning Java to learning about JSON and YAML, stuff like that, networking like Scapy and Nmap, building a Flask application. Not only that, but putting a database on the back end of that, understanding about threads and concurrency, the user interface if you choose to do that, and then messaging. And by the end of the day, you will have gone through this to this to this to this with the user interface to this with messaging, and ultimately ending up with your application that looks something like that. I hope that makes sense. I hope that gets you excited about learning all this stuff, and you'll be able to stick with us the whole way through.